"You don't belong here," the billionaire said, his voice slicing through the private jet hangar while investors and engineers turned to stare at the girl holding a cleaning cloth beside the landing gear, as if a single step closer might contaminate something worth more than her entire life today. Maybe. They laughed with him, soft executive chuckles spreading across polished shoes and tailored suits, while security guards watched the quiet maintenance girl like she had wandered into the wrong world entirely. Someone muttered that workers should stay in service corridors far away from machines worth hundreds of millions tonight here. But the girl didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't even look embarrassed. She simply wiped her hands on the worn cloth and studied the aircraft quietly, like someone listening to a language others had forgotten how to hear, while engines ticked softly behind her patient, steady breathing inside the echoing hangar. None of them noticed the small metal badge resting in her pocket, or the way her eyes followed the blinking avionics panel like a puzzle she already understood. And before the night ended, that quiet understanding would stop a disaster none of their elite engineers could explain, let alone solve. Because belonging wasn't about money uniforms or who owned the jet, it was about who could keep people alive when machines started failing. And before anyone realized what the maintenance girl truly knew, the hangar would witness the moment arrogance met skill and lost completely tonight inside this gleaming fortress. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because what happened next inside that glittering hangar wasn't just humiliation, it was the beginning of a truth nobody there was ready to face about the quiet girl standing beside the jet while alarms slept silently. Aria Cade had learned long ago that arguing with powerful people rarely changed their minds. Growing up an orphan taught her something quieter: watch carefully, listen longer, and speak only when the moment mattered more than pride, so she lowered her gaze slightly and returned to wiping grease from the billionaire Victor Halverson had already turned away, satisfied that the invisible worker understood her place, while a young intern named Luca Moreno kept watching the girl, because the way she studied the aircraft systems didn't look like cleaning. It looked like a quiet calculation beneath patience and silence tonight. Above them, the massive jet gleamed under bright hangar lights, a monument to wealth, power, and flawless technology, yet the girl could hear a faint, irregular rhythm ticking through the cooling metal panels, a warning whisper hidden inside systems nobody else bothered to notice tonight inside this cavernous building. Yet she paused just long enough to glance once more at the cockpit windows, reflecting the crowd of executives laughing near the stairs, and something inside her old training stirred like a memory refusing to stay buried, because machines spoke clearly when people listened carefully, and that jet was already beginning to fail in small, quiet ways that rich men celebrating contracts would never hear. Yet the orphan girl heard it easily, the way others heard thunder before a storm, and she knew if nobody asked the right questions tonight, something expensive, dangerous, and public might soon go terribly wrong. Still, she said nothing, because people who believed she didn't belong would never listen anyway. Instead, she finished wiping the landing gear, placed the cloth aside, and stepped back into the shadows where workers usually stood unseen, while the billionaire continued boasting to investors about perfect engineering, flawless safety tonight. Luca, however, kept staring at the quiet worker, because the expression on her face wasn't humiliation or anger, it was the focus, the kind technicians wore when diagnosing complicated problems, and that made the young intern uneasy, since nobody hired cleaners who studied jets like puzzles waiting to be solved carefully. Across the hangar, engines creaked softly, cooling after their earlier test run, and the sound made the girl tilt her head slightly, listening again to the uneven ticking hidden beneath metal panels like a heartbeat stumbling inside a machine built for perfection, while the celebration around her continued, loudly unaware. Soon the celebration would stop because that quiet ticking inside the jet was the first sign of a cascading avionics failure creeping through circuits the expensive engineers hadn't noticed yet, and when the alarms finally screamed, the same people laughing tonight would search desperately for someone who truly belonged there. And when that desperate moment arrived, the maintenance girl standing near the shadows would quietly reach into her pocket, revealing the old military badge they never expected to see, proving that belonging wasn't granted by wealth titles or invitations, but by the courage to act when everyone else froze completely. The hangar lights hummed above the polished aircraft, while the laughter of executives continued drifting through the cavernous space. Conversations about investments and market dominance echoed against steel beams, confident and loud, the kind of sound made by people who believed control was permanent. Near the landing gear, the girl finished folding the worn cleaning cloth in her hands. Grease stained the fabric, the kind of mark nobody in designer suits ever noticed, but every mechanic understood. She placed the cloth on the maintenance cart and turned slightly, eyes lifting toward the sleek jet again. Something about the aircraft's cooling rhythm still bothered her. Metal panels expanded softly as the engine settled from earlier testing. Normally that sound faded into silence after a few minutes. Tonight it didn't. Instead, a faint clicking pattern continued, irregular, almost hesitant. Her gaze moved slowly along the fuselage, stopping where the avionics bay sat beneath the forward cabin. A tiny amber indicator blinked behind a maintenance access panel. Once. Pause twice. Pause. Then 3 times in uneven succession. The girl's fingers tightened slightly against the cart handle. That sequence didn't belong to normal shutdown diagnostics. It belonged to a warning cascade. Across the hangar floor, Victor Halverson's voice boomed confidently as he guided a cluster of investors toward the jet stairs. Gentlemen, this aircraft represents the future of private aviation. Autonomous safety protocols, triple redundant avionics, there's nothing like it in the world. Polite applause followed him. The girl exhaled quietly. Triple redundant systems were impressive, unless the error existed inside the logic controlling all 3. Because then the redundancy didn't help. Then it multiplied the failure. Footsteps approached behind her. "Hey, you work here every night?" She turned slightly. The young intern stood there again, Luca Moreno, holding a small tablet against his chest like a shield. "Yes," she answered softly. His eyes flicked toward the blinking panel she'd been watching. "You were looking at the avionics housing earlier," he said. "Most people don't even know what that is." She gave a small shrug. "Machines make patterns." Luca frowned. "What kind of pattern?" Her gaze returned to the aircraft, the wrong one. The intern blinked, clearly unsure whether she was joking. Before he could ask another question, a voice cut across the hangar. Moreno, one of the senior engineers, waved impatiently from the cockpit ladder. "Get up here. We're running another pre-flight diagnostic." "Yes, sir." Luca called. He hesitated, glancing back at the quiet worker. "You sure everything's fine?" She studied the blinking light again. Once. Pause. Twice. Longer pause. 3 rapid flashes, the same sequence repeating. Her voice stayed calm. "I'm sure something isn't." The intern stared at her another moment before jogging toward the ladder. From the shadows, the girl watched him climb toward the cockpit where engineers surrounded glowing diagnostic screens. Their confident voices floated down. "System checks green. Navigation array stable. Autopilot redundancy confirmed." She listened carefully. None of them mentioned the signal pattern she'd noticed. None of them had even looked at that access panel. The girl reached for her cart again and slowly began pushing it toward the maintenance corridor. Not running, not rushing, just moving quietly the way invisible workers always did. Halfway across the hangar, Luca's voice drifted down again. "Sir, there's a small delay in the avionics sync cycle." The engineer scoffed. "That's normal latency during warm diagnostics. Ignore it." But it keeps repeating. Moreno, the man interrupted sharply. "These systems were designed by the best aerospace engineers on the planet. Trust the machine." A few investors chuckled below the ladder. The girl paused beside a tool rack. Trust the machine. She'd heard that phrase before. Years ago. Right before a simulation aircraft lost control because nobody questioned the data. Her fingers brushed against the pocket where the metal badge rested. Cold. Heavy. A reminder of a life that felt very far away. Behind her, the hangar suddenly filled with a sharp electronic chirp. One short alarm. Everyone froze. The engineers looked at each other. Victor Halverson frowned. What was that? Inside the cockpit, Luca leaned over the console. "Diagnostic alert," he said uncertainly. The lead engineer waved dismissively. "Probably a calibration glitch. Reset it." Another button press. Another pause. Then the aircraft spoke again. This time the alarm didn't chirp, it screamed. A sharp cascading warning tone burst from the cockpit speakers, echoing violently across the hangar. Red lights flashed along the avionics panels. Investors stumbled backward. Engineers shouted over one another. What the hell triggered that? Flight control logic fault. That's impossible. Victor Halverson's confident smile vanished. What's happening to my jet? Inside the cockpit, screens filled with cascading error messages. Navigation failure. Autopilot conflict. Control surface desynchronization. And beneath it all, the tiny amber indicator near the avionics bay kept blinking its quiet pattern. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. 3 rapid flashes. Across the hangar floor, the maintenance girl stopped pushing her car. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the chaos now exploding around the aircraft. Because she already knew exactly what those warnings meant. And she also knew something far more frightening. None of the engineers shouting inside that cockpit understood it yet. By the way, if this story already has you leaning forward wondering how a maintenance girl saw what experts missed, subscribe now so you don't miss the moment this quiet mystery finally explodes into truth. Above the hangar floor, Luca's voice suddenly shouted down the ladder. "We've got cascading avionics failure." And for the first time that night, the billionaires and engineers looked down at the maintenance floor. Not with arrogance, but with uncertainty. Because the person who had quietly warned about the pattern was still standing there in the shadows. Watching. The chaos above the ladder spilled outward like a crack spreading through glass. Engineers leaned over glowing consoles inside the cockpit, their voices colliding in frantic bursts, while warning alarms pulsed through the hangar in sharp electronic waves. Flight control logic conflict. That shouldn't even be possible. Reset the autopilot bus. Someone slapped a switch. Another screen turned red. Below them, Victor Halverson stood rigid beside the jet stairs, disbelief replacing the polished confidence he had worn only minutes earlier. "What exactly is failing?" he demanded. No one answered him immediately. Because the aircraft was speaking now in a language of flashing warnings and cascading diagnostics, and none of the experts seemed able to translate it fast enough. On the hangar floor, the quiet maintenance girl didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the avionics access panel where the small amber indicator continued blinking its strange rhythm. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. 3 rapid flashes. Again. And again. The same pattern repeating. Behind her, workers from nearby maintenance bays had begun drifting toward the commotion, their boots echoing against the concrete. Someone muttered under their breath. That alarm doesn't sound like a simple glitch. The girl knew it wasn't. Up in the cockpit, Luca Moreno leaned closer to the primary display, fingers hovering uncertainly above the touchscreen interface. Lines of diagnostic text scrolled endlessly. "Sir," he said nervously, "the navigation core keeps restarting. It's trying to synchronize with the backup array, but the logic keeps looping." The senior engineer frowned. "That's impossible. Those systems are isolated from each other." "But they're not acting isolated," Luca insisted. Another alarm screamed. The engineer cursed. "Fine. Cycle the secondary control module." Luca tapped the command. The jet responded instantly. With another warning. More lights flashed. A third screen turned crimson. The engineer's jaw tightened. "That's not right." Below the ladder, Halverson's voice grew sharper. "Someone explain to me why my aircraft sounds like it's falling apart." Dana Sloan had appeared beside him now, the airport operations director scanning the flashing cockpit displays with practiced eyes. "Those alarms mean the avionics network isn't stabilizing," she said carefully. "But the jet isn't even airborne yet. That's why it's concerning." Inside the cockpit, one of the engineers suddenly shouted, "Control surfaces just desynced." "What?" "The flight system thinks the rudder is moving even though it isn't." Dana inhaled slowly. "That's not a calibration error." Halverson turned toward her. "Then what is it?" Before she could answer, another voice rose from below. Quiet, calm, almost thoughtful. "The avionics logic loop is collapsing." Several heads turned. The maintenance girl had stepped closer to the ladder now, eyes still fixed on the blinking indicator beneath the fuselage. Victor Halverson stared at her like someone noticing a piece of furniture had started speaking. "You again?" he said flatly. The girl didn't look at him. "The system is trying to correct itself," she continued quietly. "But the correction algorithm is feeding the wrong signal back into the navigation core." The lead engineer leaned over the cockpit rail. And how exactly would a cleaner know that? She finally glanced up. Because the warning pattern had changed. Now the light blinked faster. Once, twice, 3 times. Pause. Then again. The loop was accelerating. "The sequence," she said softly. "What sequence?" The engineer snapped. She gestured toward the avionics bay. "That light." Luca followed her gaze. His eyes widened. "It's repeating every diagnostic reset cycle," he said slowly. The engineer frowned. "That's impossible. That indicator only activates when the control bus conflicts with the navigation core." The girl nodded slightly. "Yes." Another alarm exploded through the cockpit. Dana looked toward the ladder. "Moreno," she called, "what do your screens say?" The intern swallowed. Primary flight logic is fighting the backup navigation system. They're both trying to override each other. Dana's expression hardened. "That's a cascade failure." Halverson turned sharply toward her. "You're telling me my jet can't even run its own safety systems?" "No," she replied calmly. "I'm telling you the safety systems are fighting each other." Inside the cockpit, the engineer cursed again. "Shut everything down." "We'll reboot the avionics network." Luca hesitated. "Sir, if we shut it down completely, we'll lose the navigation alignment." "Just do it." His hand hovered over the command. Below, the girl's voice rose again. "If you shut it down now." The engineer rolled his eyes. "You'll restart the loop from the beginning." Halverson's patience snapped. "Security." 2 guards immediately stepped forward. "Remove her from the hangar." The girl didn't resist when they approached. She only looked up at the cockpit one more time. Because the blinking pattern had just changed again. The pauses were shrinking, the sequence accelerating. That meant the failure was spreading deeper through the system. Up the ladder, Luca suddenly froze. "Wait," he said. The engineer frowned. "What now?" The intern pointed toward a diagnostic line scrolling across the screen. "Sir, the control bus conflict is moving into the autopilot array." The engineer stared. "That can't happen unless—" The next alarm cut him off, louder than the others. A deep continuous warning tone filled the cockpit. Dana looked up sharply. What did you just trigger? Luca's voice trembled. I didn't touch anything. Halverson stepped backward from the stairs. What does that sound mean? No one answered immediately, because everyone inside the cockpit was staring at the same line of text. Flight Control Authority lost. The engineer whispered the words slowly. That shouldn't be possible on the ground. Another warning followed. Autopilot conflict, manual override required. Dana felt her stomach tighten. Because the aircraft wasn't supposed to reach that stage unless it was already airborne, and if the system thought it was flying, then it would start trying to correct imaginary movement, which meant the control surfaces might begin responding to commands no pilot had given. Inside the cockpit, Luca looked down toward the hangar floor again. Toward the girl, now standing quietly between two confused security guards. She met his gaze calmly. And for the first time since the alarms began, someone down there didn't look surprised. She met his gaze calmly. And for the first time since the alarms began, someone down there didn't look surprised. Luca felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. Inside the cockpit, engineers were moving faster now, hands sliding across touchscreens, voices rising in overlapping commands. Try isolating the navigation bus. It's not responding. Why is the rudder actuator showing movement? It's not moving. The sensor says it is. Another alarm slammed through the cockpit speakers louder than the rest. The aircraft sounded angry now. Below the ladder, the two security guards paused, unsure whether to keep escorting the quiet maintenance girl toward the exit or wait for new instructions. Victor Halverson had stopped watching them entirely. His attention was locked on the cockpit. What exactly is happening? He demanded again. Dana Sloan crossed her arms slowly, her eyes still tracking the storm of warnings on the engineer's screens. It looks like the avionics network believes the aircraft is already in flight, she said. Halverson frowned. But we're sitting in a hangar. Yes, she replied. That's the problem. Inside the cockpit, the lead engineer leaned over the main console, sweat forming at his temples. Moreno, read the last error. Luca swallowed. Flight stabilization conflict, autopilot seeking correction, manual override recommended. Then override it. I tried. The system rejected the command. The engineer stared. That's impossible. Below them, the quiet girl spoke again. If the system believes it's airborne, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Manual overrides won't work. Everyone turned toward her. Even the security guards paused. Halverson's patience finally snapped. I already told you. Donna raised a hand suddenly. Wait. The hangar fell strangely quiet for a moment except for the angry electronic wail pouring from the cockpit. Donna studied the girl carefully. You've been watching the avionics panel this entire time, she said. The girl nodded once. Dana's voice stayed measured. What did you see? For a moment the only sound was the blinking warning tone and the faint ticking of cooling engines. The girl tilted her head slightly toward the fuselage. That indicator. The amber light blinked again. Once, pause, twice, pause, 3 quick flashes. Luca leaned over the cockpit rail. That's the pattern I noticed earlier, he said. The lead engineer scoffed. That's just a diagnostic loop. The girl shook her head gently. No. Another alarm screamed. Inside the cockpit, a control screen flickered violently before stabilizing again. The engineer cursed. Donna looked back at the girl. Explain. The maintenance worker glanced once toward the aircraft's nose. The avionics control bus is feeding corrupted position data into the navigation core. The engineer folded his arms. And you know that. How? She didn't answer that question. Instead, she pointed quietly toward the blinking panel again. The pattern means the system is retrying a failed logic handshake. Luca's eyes widened slightly. The engineer's expression hardened. That code sequence isn't public. The girl didn't react. Halverson stepped forward, irritation returning. This is ridiculous. We're standing here listening to a janitor speculate about aerospace software while my aircraft is screaming like a broken alarm clock. Dana didn't take her eyes off the blinking panel. What happens if the handshake keeps failing? She asked. The girl's answer came immediately. The navigation core assumes the aircraft is drifting off course. Another warning tone blasted from the cockpit speakers. Dana nodded slowly. So it corrects the flight path? Yes. Halverson threw up his hands. We're not flying. The girl finally looked directly at him. But the system thinks you are. Silence spread across the hangar floor. Inside the cockpit, Luca leaned closer to the screen again. Sir, he whispered. The engineer followed his gaze. A new message had appeared. Control surface calibration active. The engineer felt his stomach drop. That's not good. Dana's voice sharpened. What does that mean? He answered quietly. It means the jet is preparing to adjust its control surfaces. Halverson stared. Adjust them for what? For flight. Across the hangar floor, the quiet maintenance girl closed her eyes for a brief second, because she knew what came next. When avionics systems believed an aircraft was airborne but stationary, they attempted to stabilize imaginary movement, which meant the control computers would start issuing commands to the rudder, the flaps, the elevators. Inside the cockpit, Luca's voice suddenly rose. Sir. The rudder actuator just engaged. The engineer spun toward the display. That's impossible, we're in maintenance mode. Another warning flashed. Automatic stabilization engaged. Dana looked sharply toward the tail of the jet. Outside the cockpit windows, something moved, very slightly. The massive vertical rudder twitched, just a few inches, but it moved. Gasps spread through the hangar. Halverson's voice cracked. Why is my aircraft moving? The engineer whispered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Because if the stabilization system kept issuing commands, the aircraft could start moving multiple control surfaces at once. And the hydraulic pressure behind those systems was powerful enough to tear components apart if they fought against locked maintenance braces. Luca looked down the ladder again, at the quiet girl. Her expression hadn't changed. She simply watched the aircraft the way a surgeon studies a patient moments before deciding whether to cut. Inside the cockpit, the engineer slammed a command into the console. Force shutdown. The system rejected it instantly. Access denied, flight mode active. Donna inhaled slowly. We don't have much time, she said. Halverson turned toward the guards. Why is she still standing here? But before anyone moved again, the girl spoke quietly. If you don't interrupt the loop, another loud hydraulic whine echoed through the hangar. The jet will start correcting its altitude. Everyone stared at her. She finished calmly, and that's when things break. Her words hung in the hangar air just as another hydraulic whine rolled through the aircraft. The sound was deeper this time, stronger. Everyone turned toward the jet instinctively. Along the trailing edge of the massive wing, one of the flaps shifted slightly against its maintenance lock. Metal groaned. Luca felt his throat tighten. Sir, he whispered. Inside the cockpit, the lead engineer stared at the control screen, disbelief spreading across his face. That shouldn't be moving. Dana's voice cut through the rising panic. Why is the system still issuing commands? The engineer tapped the console again. Because it thinks we're flying. Another warning message flashed. Automatic correction active. On the hangar floor, Victor Halverson's voice rose sharply. Shut it down, I'm trying. The engineer shouted back. But the system wasn't listening anymore, because the loop had already taken control. Below the ladder, the quiet maintenance girl watched the blinking amber light again. Once, pause, twice, pause, 3 rapid flashes, Now the pattern was accelerating, which meant the avionics logic was failing faster. The control computers were chasing errors that didn't exist, and every correction pushed the system deeper into conflict. One of the security guards shifted uneasily beside her. "What happens if it keeps doing that?" he muttered. She answered without looking at him. "The system keeps trying to stabilize imaginary movement." The guard frowned. "But we're not moving." She glanced toward the wing again. "The aircraft thinks it is." Inside the cockpit, Luca suddenly leaned forward. "Sir, the pitch stabilizer just activated." The engineer spun toward the screen. "That actuator is locked." Another metallic groan echoed through the hangar. Outside the cockpit window, the horizontal stabilizer twitched violently against its brace. Dana's voice hardened. "If that brace snaps..." The engineer finished her sentence. "The stabilizer could rip the actuator apart." Halverson looked from the wing to the cockpit, panic finally replacing his earlier arrogance. "You're telling me my aircraft is tearing itself apart?" Dana answered quietly. "If the system keeps issuing corrections, yes." The billionaire turned toward the security guards again. "Why is she still here?" But before they could move the girl again, Luca's voice carried down the ladder. "Wait." Everyone looked up. The intern pointed toward the blinking panel near the avionics bay. "That light, it's repeating the same sequence." The engineer snapped impatiently. "That's just the diagnostic loop." But Luca shook his head. "No, it's not random." The maintenance girl finally looked up at him again. He hesitated before speaking. "You noticed it earlier too, didn't you?" She nodded once. Dana studied her carefully. "You knew something was wrong before the alarm started?" "Yes." Halverson's frustration returned instantly. "And you decided not to say anything?" The girl answered calmly. "You already told me I didn't belong near the aircraft." Silence spread across the hangar. The words landed harder than any accusation. For a moment, even the alarms seemed quieter. Then, another warning shrieked through the cockpit. Autopilot authority escalating. Inside the cockpit, the engineer slammed both hands onto the console. "This doesn't make sense." Luca stared at the error lines scrolling across the screen. "The system keeps trying to stabilize altitude." Dana's brow tightened. "But we're on the ground." "Yes," Luca whispered. "That's why it keeps correcting." Another hydraulic whine echoed through the jet. This time, the rudder jerked harder against its lock. The brace rattled. One of the mechanics near the wing shouted, "If that actuator tears loose, we'll lose the entire control assembly." Halverson spun toward Dana. "Fix it." She didn't move. Because the truth was obvious now. None of the engineers knew how. Down on the hangar floor, the girl stepped forward slowly. The guards didn't stop her this time. Their attention was fixed on the violent movement of the aircraft behind her. The blinking indicator flashed again. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. 3 quick bursts. She watched it carefully, listening to the machine. Behind her, Dana's voice broke the tension. "You understand what that pattern means?" It wasn't a question. The girl nodded slightly. "The navigation core is feeding corrupted altitude data into the control bus." The engineer scoffed. "That's impossible. Those systems cross-check each other." "Yes," she said quietly. "That's why the loop keeps repeating." Luca's eyes widened. "The backup system thinks the primary system is wrong, and the primary system thinks the backup system is wrong," she finished. Dana exhaled slowly. "So they're both trying to correct each other?" "Yes." Another warning exploded through the cockpit. "Control surface limit approaching." The engineer whispered a curse. "If the actuators keep fighting the maintenance locks..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the hangar understood what would happen. Hydraulic pressure strong enough to control a flying aircraft could easily rip apart stationary hardware. And if that happened, the damage wouldn't stop at the wing. Dana turned toward the girl again. How do we interrupt the loop? The maintenance workers studied the aircraft silently. The blinking light, the timing of the alarms, the rhythm of the failing system. Then she said something that made the engineer freeze. You can't interrupt it from the cockpit. Halverson stared at her, then where? She looked toward the avionics bay beneath the fuselage. The logic conflict is inside the control bus. The engineer frowned. That panel only opens during deep maintenance, yes. Another warning tone screamed through the jet. The rudder slammed violently against its brace. The metal bracket groaned. Dana looked from the wing to the girl. How long before something breaks? The answer came quietly. Not long. The hangar trembled again as another hydraulic command forced the stabilizer to move. And for the first time since the alarms began, every engineer in the cockpit looked down toward the maintenance floor. At the girl who had been quietly listening to the aircraft from the very beginning. By the way, if you're wondering how the person everyone dismissed might be the only one who understands this machine, subscribe now, because the next moment will prove whether skill or arrogance decides what happens next. Across the hangar, the blinking light flashed again. Faster now. The loop was tightening. And the aircraft was running out of time. Another violent shudder ran through the jet as the stabilization system pushed against the locked hardware again. The hydraulic pump screamed under the fuselage, a sharp mechanical howl that echoed across the hangar like a warning siren. Metal groaned. The rudder slammed against its brace once more. This time the entire tail assembly vibrated. Inside the cockpit, Luca grabbed the console rail. Sir, actuator pressure just spiked. The lead engineer stared at the screen. That brace can't take many more hits like that. Dana Sloan's voice sharpened from the hangar floor. How long? The engineer didn't hesitate. Maybe 2 more correction cycles. Below the ladder, Victor Halverson's face had gone pale. You're telling me my jet is about to destroy itself while it's sitting in my own hangar? No one answered him, because the system screamed again. Control surface limit exceeded. The girl stepped closer to the aircraft. The security guards didn't stop her now. In fact, they moved aside without thinking, like people stepping out of the path of someone who suddenly seemed to know exactly where she was going. Her eyes stayed on the blinking amber light. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. 3 rapid flashes. The pattern had shortened again. That meant the control loop was accelerating. Inside the cockpit, Luca leaned over the rail again. What do we do? He called down. The girl finally spoke. You have to break the handshake. The engineer frowned. What handshake? The corrupted data exchange between the navigation core and the control bus. Dana crossed her arms, studying the girl carefully. And how do we do that? The answer came immediately. You isolate the bus physically. The engineer scoffed. That's impossible from the cockpit, yes, she said. It is. Silence spread again. Halverson threw his hands up. Then what are we even talking about? The girl pointed calmly toward the underside of the fuselage, the avionics bay. The engineer stared down at her. That panel contains the primary control interface, yes. And you think we're going to start opening aircraft panels while the system is actively fighting itself? She didn't react. Another warning alarm cut through the cockpit. Automatic correction active. The rudder jerked violently again. The brace holding it rattled with a harsh metallic crack. One of the mechanics shouted from the wing, "That lock is bending." Dana's voice dropped lower. If that actuator snaps free, we could lose the entire control assembly. The engineer ran a hand through his hair. Even if we opened the panel, the control bus is buried behind 3 layers of avionics housing. Nobody could isolate it fast enough. The girl tilted her head slightly. Someone could. He frowned. Who? She reached slowly into the pocket of her worn work jacket. For a moment, no one spoke. The alarms continued screaming. Hydraulic pumps whined. Metal groaned again beneath the wing. Then she pulled out a small piece of metal. A badge. Old. Worn. The engraved insignia caught the bright hanger lights as she turned it in her fingers. Luca leaned forward over the rail. What is that? She lifted it just high enough for them to see clearly. The eagle insignia. The serial engraving. Air Force. Avionics Engineering Division. For a moment the hangar went completely silent. Even the alarms seemed distant. The lead engineer's mouth opened slightly. That can't be real. The girl met his eyes calmly. I worked avionics diagnostics for military aircraft. Halverson blinked. You? She nodded once, before I left. Dana studied the badge carefully. You're trained to isolate flight control buses under live system conflict? Yes. The engineer looked from the badge to the aircraft. Then back to her. You're telling me a maintenance cleaner is actually an avionics engineer? She slipped the badge back into her pocket. I used to be. Another violent correction hit the aircraft. The stabilizer slammed against its brace again. This time, a loud metallic crack echoed through the hangar. One of the mechanics shouted. That bracket's about to fail. Donna turned toward the cockpit. If that lock breaks while the actuator's under pressure, the engineer finished the thought. The control surface could tear loose. Halverson looked around at the growing chaos. You people said this jet was the safest aircraft in the world. Dana didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the quiet girl standing beneath the fuselage. Can you stop it? She asked. The girl looked toward the avionics bay. The blinking light. The trembling stabilizer, the warning tones echoing through the hangar. Yes, she said. Halverson barked a laugh. You expect me to let a janitor dismantle my aircraft? The girl didn't respond to him. Instead, she looked at Dana. If the loop continues another 30 seconds, the actuator will overload. Dana nodded slowly. And if you isolate the bus? The system will reboot its navigation logic. The engineer frowned. That could reset the entire flight computer, yes. And you're sure it will stop the loop? She answered calmly. It will stop the conflict. Another violent correction slammed through the jet. The rudder brace shrieked under pressure. Halverson looked up toward the cockpit again. Engineer. The man hesitated. Then he looked down at the girl one more time, at the calm expression, at the badge she had just shown them, and at the aircraft shaking itself apart around them. Finally, he said quietly, She's right about the loop. The words hung in the cockpit like something fragile. For a moment, no one moved. Not the engineers gripping the consoles, not the investors standing frozen beside the jet stairs, not even Victor Halverson, whose disbelief had finally been overtaken by something colder, uncertainty. Then the aircraft screamed again. A violent hydraulic surge slammed through the control system, forcing the rudder hard against its brace. The metal bracket shrieked. Down on the hangar floor, a mechanic shouted, That lock is cracking. Dana Sloan's head snapped toward the tail of the jet. The stabilizer shuddered again, the entire structure vibrating as pressure fought against hardware never meant to move under maintenance locks. How much longer? She called up. Inside the cockpit, the lead engineer's eyes flicked across 3 different warning screens. Less than 20 seconds if the correction cycle keeps accelerating. Victor Halverson stepped forward, anger flashing again through the fear. So stop it. The engineer slammed another command into the console. The aircraft rejected it immediately. Access denied, flight mode active. The engineer exhaled slowly. It's not accepting cockpit authority anymore. Halverson stared at him. That's ridiculous. This is my aircraft. Dana's voice cut in quietly. Right now, the flight computer doesn't care who owns it, another warning erupted through the speakers. Control surface limit exceeded. The stabilizer jerked again. This time, the entire wing shuddered. People began backing away instinctively. If the actuator tore loose, the snapping metal could whip across the hangar with lethal force. Below the fuselage, the girl had already moved closer to the avionics panel. Her fingers brushed the smooth metal surface lightly, feeling the faint vibration running through the aircraft's skin. The system was panicking. Machines didn't feel fear, but they reacted to bad data the way humans reacted to danger, faster and more aggressively with every failed correction. The blinking amber indicator pulsed again. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. 3 flashes. Now the pauses were barely there at all. Inside the cockpit, Luca leaned over the rail again. "Sir, the handshake cycle just shortened again." The engineer nodded grimly. "The navigation core is retrying faster." Dana turned toward the girl. "You said you could isolate the control bus." "Yes. How long will it take?" The girl studied the access panel. The screws. The latch. The wiring compartment behind it. 10 seconds once the panel is open, Halverson's voice exploded behind her. "This is insane." Everyone turned. "You're seriously considering letting a maintenance worker start dismantling avionics systems on a 9-figure aircraft?" Dana didn't flinch. "We're seconds away from the control actuators tearing themselves apart. That's a maintenance problem." "No," Dana said quietly. "It's a flight control problem." Another violent shudder ripped through the stabilizer. This time the brace bent visibly. A mechanic yelled from across the hangar, "That lock won't hold another cycle." Halverson pointed at the girl. "If she damages anything, I'll have her arrested." The girl didn't even look at him. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward Dana. "The longer you wait, the harder the reboot will be." Dana studied her face carefully. No panic, no hesitation, just a steady focus of someone analyzing a problem. Inside the cockpit, the engineer suddenly swore. The system just activated secondary stabilization. Luca's eyes widened. "That means it's trying to correct altitude, AND heading." Dana inhaled slowly. "So 2 control systems are now fighting each other?" "Yes," another alarm screamed. 2 separate hydraulic systems activated at once. The rudder jerked violently. The stabilizer slammed downward. The brace screeched under the strain. Halverson looked around wildly. Someone shut it down. The engineer shouted back. "We can't." Dana finally turned toward the girl again. "If you open that panel, you'll be working on a live avionics bus. I know. One wrong move could fry the entire control computer." The girl nodded slightly. "I know." Halverson barked a harsh laugh. "And you're still considering this?" Dana didn't answer him. Her eyes stayed on the girl. "You said you worked military avionics." "Yes." "Combat aircraft?" "Yes." Dana exhaled slowly. "Those systems are more complicated than this one." "Yes." Halverson threw up his hands. "Dana, this is absurd." She turned toward him calmly. "Victor, your aircraft is currently attempting to correct imaginary flight conditions." Another violent shudder rippled through the wing. "If we don't stop it, the hydraulic actuators will destroy the control assemblies." The billionaire's jaw tightened. "And if she fails?" Donna's answer was blunt. "Then the aircraft is already lost anyway." Silence spread across the hangar again. The stabilizer jerked once more. The brace shrieked, metal bent. Inside the cockpit, Luca shouted, "Brace integrity dropping." The engineer looked down toward the maintenance floor, at the quiet girl standing beside the avionics bay. Then he looked at the screens again, at the loop repeating faster and faster. Finally, he spoke. "She's the only one who recognized the handshake conflict." Halverson glared at him. "You're siding with her?" "I'm siding with physics." Dana stepped toward the girl. If you're wrong, the control computer could burn out. The girl placed one hand on the avionics panel latch. I won't be wrong. Dana studied her for one final moment. Then she stepped back. Do it. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. The girl turned the latch. The avionics panel opened with a sharp metallic click. And inside the cockpit, every alarm suddenly escalated. The warning tone shifted from intermittent bursts into one continuous scream that filled the entire hangar like a siren announcing disaster. Engineers instinctively stepped back from their consoles as the aircraft system spiraled deeper into conflict. Secondary stabilization is active. Luca shouted from the cockpit ladder. The lead engineer stared at the main display, disbelief creeping across his face. That shouldn't be possible while we're grounded, but the screens told a different story. The flight computer believed the jet was airborne, drifting violently off course. Every fraction of a second it issued new corrections, forcing the control surfaces to fight against their locked maintenance braces. Below the fuselage, the girl crouched beside the open avionics bay. The interior compartment glowed faintly with rows of tightly packed circuit modules and thick bundles of fiber cables. Cooling fans hummed softly beneath the storm of alarms echoing through the hangar. Her eyes moved quickly across the architecture. Military avionics were more complex than this system. But complexity didn't matter. Logic did. Behind her, Dana Sloan watched carefully. You said 10 seconds once the panel was open. Yes, how long before the actuator breaks? The lead engineer answered from the cockpit. Maybe 15 seconds. Halverson's voice cut sharply through the noise. 15 seconds to destroy a 9-figure aircraft. The girl ignored him. Her fingers moved across the control modules, tracing the layout with practiced familiarity. Navigation core. Control bus interface. Redundant logic relay. There. A small black junction module sat between two fiber connections. The handshake controller. The component translating navigation data into control commands. If corrupted altitude data reached that module, it would keep feeding the correction loop forever. Luca leaned over the cockpit rail, watching her. How does she even know where to look? The engineer answered quietly. She's hunting the handshake relay. Dana's eyebrows lifted slightly. That fast? The engineer nodded once. That's exactly where I'd start. Another violent hydraulic surge rippled through the aircraft. The rudder slammed against its brace again. This time, the bracket cracked audibly. A mechanic shouted from the tail. The lock splitting, Halverson looked ready to explode. If that thing snaps... Dana finished his sentence calmly. The actuator will tear itself apart. The girl's voice rose quietly from beneath the fuselage. I found it. Inside the cockpit, Luca blinked. You already isolated the relay? Not yet. She studied the module carefully. 2 fiber channels fed the handshake. One from navigation, one from the flight control bus. Disconnect either cable and the loop would collapse, but doing it wrong could surge the entire system. She reached into the tool pouch hanging from her belt, not fancy tools, just the small insulated driver maintenance workers used to open equipment panels. Behind her, Dana spoke again. Once you isolate it, what happens? The navigation core reboots? And the control bus? It stops receiving corrupted altitude data. Another alarm blasted through the aircraft. Control surface limit critical. Inside the cockpit, Luca shouted. Actuator pressure spiking again. The stabilizer jerked violently. The cracked brace screamed under the strain. The engineer checked his screen quickly. We're down to one more correction cycle before the bracket fails. Halverson's voice rose in panic. Then why are we still talking? The girl didn't rush. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. Machines punished panic. Precision fixed them. She positioned the insulated driver against the connector locking clip. Her fingers paused briefly. Not from doubt, from calculation. If she cut the wrong side first, the corrupted signal might surge the control bus. If she cut both simultaneously, the flight computer might crash entirely. Dana watched the movement carefully. You're choosing which channel to isolate, yes, navigation or control bus. The girl answered quietly. Control bus. The engineer leaned over the cockpit rail again. That will starve the actuator logic of corrupted altitude data. Dana nodded. So the stabilization loop collapses? Yes, Halverson crossed his arms impatiently. Just pull the damn cable. The girl ignored him again. Instead, she glanced toward the blinking amber indicator above the panel. Once. Pause. Twice. 3 flashes. The loop timing. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The next correction cycle is starting. Inside the cockpit, Lucas shouted. Hydraulic system charging. Dana's voice sharpened. Now, the girl positioned the driver under the connector latch. One quick twist, the locking clip released. Her fingers closed around the fiber channel. Another violent whine surged through the aircraft as the stabilization system prepared its next correction. The cracked brace shuddered violently. Inside the cockpit, the screens flashed. Halverson stared wide-eyed. Is she doing it? The engineer whispered quietly. If she's right, this will break the handshake loop. For a brief moment, the hangar seemed frozen. The girl inhaled slowly. Then she pulled the connector free. The effect was immediate. Inside the cockpit, every warning display flickered. For one terrifying second, the entire avionics system went dark. Halverson shouted, "What did she just do?" Then the screens rebooted. Navigation core resetting. Control bus synchronization restarting. The hydraulic whine stopped instantly. The rudder froze. The stabilizer stopped moving. Silence flooded the hangar. No alarms, no grinding metal, just the quiet hum of electronics stabilizing. Inside the cockpit, Lucas stared at the screens. The loop is gone. The engineer checked another display. Control surface authority restored. Manual override available. He exhaled slowly. Good Lord. Below the fuselage, the girl gently closed the avionics panel again. The aircraft sat perfectly still now, as if nothing had happened. Dana Sloan folded her arms slowly. 10 seconds, she said softly. Victor Halverson looked around the silent hangar, at the engineers, at the investors, at the aircraft that had nearly destroyed itself. Then finally, at the maintenance girl standing beneath it, and for the first time that night, no one in the hangar laughed. By the way, if you're still watching and wondering how the person they said didn't belong just saved an entire aircraft, subscribe now, because what happens next will make that humiliation earlier feel very different. For a long moment after the connector snapped free, the hangar remained silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a finished task. The stunned kind. The kind that followed something nobody had expected to see. Inside the cockpit, Lucas stared at the screens as if they might suddenly change their minds. Navigation cores stabilized. Control bus synchronized. Manual flight authority restored. He blinked twice. "Sir," he said slowly. The lead engineer leaned closer to the console, checking each diagnostic line carefully. The scrolling warnings had stopped. Every control surface indicator showed neutral position. The hydraulic pressure gauge returned to its resting range. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It's stable. Below the ladder, Dana Sloan turned her attention to the tail of the aircraft. The cracked brace still held the rudder in place, though the metal bracket had clearly warped from the strain. "Mechanics," she called calmly, "secure the control surfaces and depressurize the hydraulic lines." Several technicians moved immediately, jogging toward the wing and stabilizer with renewed urgency. They worked carefully now. Not because of the aircraft. Because of the person standing beneath it. Victor Halverson hadn't moved. His gaze remained locked on the quiet maintenance girl. She had already stepped back from the avionics panel, wiping a faint line of dust from her fingers onto the same worn cloth she'd been holding earlier. Nothing about her posture suggested triumph. No pride, no relief, just the calm efficiency of someone who had finished a job. The billionaire finally spoke. "That's impossible." Dana didn't look at him. "No," she said quietly. "It's engineering." Up in the cockpit, Luca climbed halfway down the ladder before stopping. You shut down the handshake relay." The girl glanced up slightly. "Yes. How did you know which channel to isolate?" She tilted her head toward the aircraft. "The pattern," Luca frowned. "The blinking indicator?" "Yes. That tiny light told you the entire avionics logic was collapsing?" "It told me where the signal conflict started." The intern stared at her with open amazement. The lead engineer descended the ladder next. Unlike Halverson, his expression held no anger, only curiosity. "You identified a control bus handshake conflict by ear and pattern recognition." The girl shrugged slightly. "Machines repeat themselves when they're confused." He crossed his arms slowly. "That diagnostic code isn't even visible on the primary screens, no. So how did you learn it?" She hesitated briefly, then answered simply. "Military aircraft talk the same way." Across the hangar, mechanics finished securing the damaged brace. One of them called out. "Hydraulics depressurized." Dana nodded. "Good." She turned back toward the girl. "You prevented a cascade actuator failure." The girl didn't respond. Dana continued calmly. "If that stabilizer had broken loose under pressure, the damage would have traveled straight through the control assembly." Halverson finally snapped. "Yes, we all understand the aircraft was in danger." Dana turned toward him slowly. "Your aircraft was 30 seconds away from destroying its own flight controls." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there was nothing to argue. Everyone in the hangar had seen it happen. The alarms, the twisting stabilizer, the cracking brace, and the moment everything stopped. Luca looked between them nervously. She knew exactly what to disconnect. The engineer nodded. She isolated the corrupted data path before the control computer burned itself out. Halverson gestured toward the fuselage. "My engineers were working on it." Dana raised an eyebrow. "Your engineers were resetting screens." The lead engineer didn't protest. Instead, he looked directly at the girl again. "You worked avionics diagnostics in the Air Force?" "Yes. What unit?" She hesitated again. "Engineering Support Division." "That's vague." She didn't elaborate. Lucas spoke suddenly. But she knew the handshake relay instantly. The engineer nodded slowly. "Yes." He turned back toward Halverson. "You don't get that kind of recognition from textbooks." The billionaire frowned. "What are you implying?" The engineer answered bluntly. "She didn't just study avionics." His gaze shifted back to the girl. "You diagnosed aircraft under live system failure." Silence settled again. The girl finally spoke quietly. "Yes." Dana folded her arms thoughtfully. "So you left the Air Force and ended up cleaning hangars?" The question wasn't mocking, just curious. The girl's eyes moved briefly toward the enormous aircraft beside them. "Life changes," Halverson scoffed. "That doesn't explain how someone with that background ends up pushing a cleaning cart." She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the cloth again and wiped a thin streak of grease from the avionics panel where her hands had rested. The simple motion somehow made the silence heavier, because it reminded everyone of what had happened earlier that evening. The laughter, the words, "You don't belong here." Luca shifted awkwardly. "She noticed the failure before any of us." Dana nodded slowly. "Yes." The lead engineer exhaled again. "Which means one uncomfortable truth." Halverson looked irritated. "And what truth is that?" The engineer gestured toward the quiet worker standing beneath the jet. The only person in this hangar who truly understood what was happening. He paused. Was the one we almost threw out. The words settled over the hangar heavier than the silence that followed. Victor Halverson looked from the engineer to the quiet maintenance girl as if the sentence itself were some kind of mistake. That's dramatic, he muttered. But no one laughed, because the aircraft beside them still carried the marks of what had nearly happened. The cracked brace on the stabilizer, the warped rudder lock, the faint smell of overheated hydraulics still lingering in the air. Dana Sloan stepped toward the tail section where the mechanics were finishing their work. Report. One of them wiped grease from his hands. Actuator housing took pressure but didn't fail. If that stabilizer had moved another inch, we'd be replacing half the control assembly. Dana nodded once. Then we were seconds away. The mechanic glanced past her toward the girl standing quietly beneath the fuselage. Yeah, he said. Seconds. Inside the cockpit, the lead engineer returned to the console for one final diagnostic run. The system screens flickered through checks now that the corrupted handshake relay had been isolated. Navigation core, stable. Flight control bus, synchronized. Autopilot authority, inactive. He leaned back slowly. It's clean, he said. Luca looked relieved. So the aircraft is safe again? Yes, the engineer hesitated. Because she stopped the loop below them, Halverson rubbed his temples in frustration. I still don't understand how this happened. Dana answered calmly. A corrupted altitude packet from the navigation array. That doesn't explain why the redundancy didn't stop it. The redundancy caused it. Halverson frowned. Explain. She pointed toward the avionics panel. The navigation system believed the aircraft was climbing. The control bus believed the navigation data was wrong. Both systems kept correcting each other until the loop accelerated. And your engineers couldn't stop it? They were looking for a sensor failure. Donna gestured toward the girl again. She looked for a logic conflict. Halverson crossed his arms stubbornly. So she got lucky. The lead engineer climbed down the ladder and walked across the hangar floor. No, he said quietly. That wasn't luck. He stopped a few feet from the girl. Luck doesn't isolate a corrupted control bus under live stabilization pressure. Halverson scoffed. You're impressed. I'm realistic. The engineer looked toward the cracked stabilizer brace. If she hadn't pulled that connector when she did, the actuator would have snapped the lock. Dana finished the thought. And the stabilizer would have torn the control assembly apart. Luca spoke softly from the ladder. That aircraft would never fly again. Halverson's jaw tightened. That's speculation. Dana shook her head. No, she gestured toward the warped metal bracket. That's physics. Another mechanic approached from the wing. Hydraulic lines are fully depressurized, Dana nodded. Good. Leave the control surfaces locked until we run a full avionics audit. The mechanic looked toward the girl again. Who is she, anyway? Halverson answered quickly. A cleaner. The engineer's voice followed immediately after. No. The billionaire turned toward him sharply. What do you mean, no? The engineer folded his arms. A cleaner doesn't identify a handshake loop by listening to a cooling engine. Halverson rolled his eyes. Oh, please. Dana didn't look amused. Victor, you humiliated her in front of your investors less than an hour ago. That's irrelevant. Is it? The hangar fell quiet again. The girl still hadn't spoken. She had stepped back toward her maintenance cart now, placing the cloth neatly beside the small toolbox attached to the side. Just another worker finishing a shift. Luca climbed the rest of the way down the ladder and walked toward her. You heard the failure before the alarm started. She nodded slightly. Yes, How? The avionics bus changes the sound of the cooling system when it's stuck in a loop. Luca blinked. You can hear that? Yes. The engineer nodded thoughtfully. Experienced avionics technicians sometimes can. Halverson shook his head in disbelief. This is unbelievable. Dana's tone stayed calm. What part? That someone with this level of training is pushing a cleaning cart in my hangar. The girl picked up the cart handle again. Work is work. Halverson watched her for a moment. Then he said the one thing that made everyone pause. You still don't belong here. Luca turned sharply. What? Halverson gestured toward the aircraft. This is a restricted aviation facility. The words hung in the air, the same ones he had used earlier. But this time, the hangar reacted differently. The engineer raised an eyebrow. Victor. Dana's expression hardened. You might want to think carefully about what you say next. Halverson looked around the hangar, at the engineers, at the mechanics, at the aircraft that had nearly destroyed itself. Then, back at the quiet girl. She hadn't stopped moving. The maintenance cart rolled slowly across the concrete floor as she began heading toward the service corridor again. No anger, no argument, just quiet footsteps leaving the place she had just saved. Luca watched her go. She's really just going to leave? Dana folded her arms. That's usually what people do when they finish a job. The engineer looked toward Halverson again. You told her she didn't belong here. Halverson frowned. Yes. The engineer nodded once. Well, he gestured toward the silent aircraft. The machine seems to disagree. The words lingered in the air as the maintenance cart rolled slowly toward the service corridor. For a moment, nobody moved. Victor Halverson stood rigid beside the aircraft stairs, his gaze following the quiet figure walking away from the hangar floor she had just saved. Dana Sloan glanced toward him. You should probably say something. Halverson frowned. About what? The fact that the aircraft still exists. Across the hangar, mechanics continued securing the stabilizer and inspecting the cracked brace. Their voices carried through the space in low murmurs. Control bus nearly cooked itself. Never seen a loop escalate that fast, and she just pulled the connector like it was nothing. Inside the cockpit, Luca finished shutting down the remaining diagnostics before climbing down the ladder again. He watched the maintenance cart rolling toward the exit. She's leaving. The lead engineer nodded quietly. I noticed. Luca turned to him. You're not going to stop her? The engineer glanced toward Halverson. That's not my decision. Dana's patience finally thinned. Victor, the billionaire, sighed. What now? You humiliated her. I corrected an employee who was standing in a restricted area. She prevented your aircraft from destroying itself. Halverson opened his mouth, then stopped, because no argument fit the situation anymore. The hangar had witnessed everything. The alarms, the shaking aircraft, the moment the girl opened the avionics bay and stopped the system none of the engineers had managed to control. Across the concrete floor, the maintenance cartwheels rattled softly as it approached the service corridor doors. Luca suddenly walked forward. Wait. The girl paused, not dramatically, just enough for the cart to stop rolling. She turned slightly. Luca caught up with her, breathing a little harder than necessary. You're just going to go back to cleaning floors after that? Her expression remained calm. That's my job, but you're an avionics engineer. I was. You still are. She didn't answer. Behind them, footsteps echoed across the hangar. Halverson had finally started walking. Dana followed beside him. The engineer remained a few steps behind, watching the exchange with quiet interest. The billionaire stopped several feet away from the maintenance cart. For a moment he looked like he might say something angry again. Instead, he studied the aircraft behind them. The silent jet. The cracked brace mechanics were replacing, the engineers still staring at their screens. Then, he looked back at the girl. You recognized the failure before anyone else, yes. You isolated the corrupted control bus under live system pressure, yes. Halverson folded his arms slowly. That aircraft cost me $180 million. The girl waited. And 30 seconds ago, he continued, it was seconds away from tearing itself apart. She nodded slightly. Yes. Halverson glanced around the hangar, at the investors who had quietly gathered near the stairs, at the engineers who were pretending not to listen, at Donna. Then he said something that sounded very different from his voice earlier that evening. I may have misjudged the situation. Donna raised an eyebrow. That's one way to phrase it. Halverson ignored the comment. Instead, he looked directly at the girl again. You're telling me you diagnosed a cascade avionics conflict by listening to the cooling system? Yes. The lead engineer spoke from behind him. That's exactly what she did. Halverson nodded slowly. That kind of skill doesn't disappear just because someone leaves the military. The girl remained silent. Luca couldn't hold back anymore. She belongs here, more than half the people in this hangar. Several mechanics nearby nodded quietly. Halverson looked around at them, then back at the girl. I said earlier that you didn't belong here. The words echoed in the hangar again. But now they sounded different. He exhaled slowly. That was incorrect. No one spoke. The girl rested one hand on the maintenance cart handle. People make mistakes. Halverson studied her face. You saved my aircraft, yes, you saved the reputation of my engineering division. She shrugged slightly. I stopped a logic loop. The engineer chuckled quietly behind him. That's a very modest way of describing it. Dana crossed her arms again. So what happens now? Halverson looked toward the aircraft once more, then back at the girl. What happens now, he said slowly, is that I correct my earlier statement. The hangar waited. Because everyone understood what he meant. The billionaire gestured toward the silent jet behind them. You do belong here. The girl considered the aircraft for a moment. The enormous machine gleaming under hangar lights, the engineers who had finally stopped underestimating her, the intern still staring at her like he'd just witnessed magic. Then she said something that made several mechanics grin quietly. I belonged here the whole time. Halverson almost smiled. For the first time that night, no one argued with her. The hangar felt different now. The same lights still hummed above the polished aircraft, the same cold concrete stretched across the floor, and the same engineers stood beside diagnostic screens. Yet something in the air had shifted quietly, the way pressure changes after a storm finally passes. Victor Halverson looked back toward the jet. The mechanics had already replaced the damaged brace, their tools clinking softly against metal as they finished securing the stabilizer. Engineers continued reviewing system logs, murmuring to one another as they traced the failure sequence that had nearly destroyed the aircraft. But their attention kept drifting toward the same place, toward the maintenance cart, toward the quiet girl beside it. Dana Sloan watched the room carefully. Moments earlier, this hangar had been divided by invisible lines, executives above, workers below, people who commanded, and people who obeyed. Now, those lines looked thinner. Luca Moreno stood beside the cart, still shaking his head in disbelief. You saved the entire aircraft, he said. The girl adjusted the cloth folded on the cart. It was a logic error, that's not the point. He gestured toward the jet. You heard something nobody else did. She glanced briefly at the aircraft again. Machines tell the truth if you listen carefully. Behind them, the lead engineer approached slowly. He carried a tablet now, diagnostic graphs glowing across the screen. I finished reviewing the system logs, he said. Dana raised an eyebrow. And? The corrupted altitude packet originated in the navigation array just like she said. Halverson folded his arms thoughtfully. And the redundancy loop? Exactly as she predicted. The engineer tilted the screen so they could see the cascading logic failures recorded in the system. Once the navigation core started feeding corrupted altitude data, the control bus tried to correct it. But the correction made the navigation system think the aircraft was climbing faster. Dana nodded slowly. So the loop kept accelerating? Yes. The engineer looked at the girl again. Until the handshake relay was isolated, Halverson stared at the graphs quietly. And if that hadn't happened? The engineer didn't hesitate. The stabilizer actuator would have torn through the maintenance lock within the next correction cycle. Dana finished the thought. And the control assembly would have failed. Luca let out a long breath. That aircraft would have been destroyed. Silence settled again. The girl didn't react to the conversation. She simply lifted the cleaning cloth and wiped a faint fingerprint from the metal side of the cart. Work finished. Tools organized. Just another shift ending. Halverson watched the simple motion for a moment. You could work anywhere in aviation with skills like that. She shrugged slightly. Maybe. Why here? She glanced toward the hangar doors where the night sky waited beyond the glass. It was quiet. Dana almost smiled. Not tonight, no. Luca leaned against the cart. You know everyone in this hangar is going to talk about this for years, right? The girl looked mildly confused. About what? The intern laughed softly. You stopping a 9-figure jet from destroying itself while everyone else panicked. The engineer nodded. That's not something people forget. Halverson studied her one more time. Then he said something very different from the man who had spoken earlier that night. If you ever decide you want a different job than pushing that cart, he gestured toward the aircraft. My engineering division would benefit from someone who can hear problems before computers do. She thought about that quietly, then answered in the same calm tone she had used all evening. I'll think about it. Dana turned toward the aircraft once more. Run a full avionics inspection before morning, she told the engineers. Document everything. They nodded. The hangar slowly returned to its normal rhythm, tools clinking, technicians talking, machines humming softly under bright lights. But every so often someone looked toward the maintenance cart again. Not with amusement anymore. With respect. Because earlier that night a billionaire had laughed and said a quiet worker didn't belong in that hangar. Yet when the aircraft began tearing itself apart, the only person who understood what was happening had been the one standing where power never bothered to look. The worker. The orphan girl. The one holding a cleaning cloth and an old military badge in her pocket. And in the end, the truth had spoken louder than titles ever could. Because belonging isn't decided by who owns the aircraft. It's decided by who can keep it flying. Ask me for the next story title. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. They laughed at the janitor fixing the power grid until the city went dark. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?